Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Growing up, I always loved reading news about faraway places. Whether it was wars, elections, revolutions, or pop culture, there was something deeply satisfying about following events unfolding far from where I lived. Later, when I moved to Beijing, I got to know foreign correspondents working for some of the biggest news organizations in the world. At a moment when the world was eager to understand what China is really like and why it matters, it was clear that telling China's story, fairly and vividly, was never going to be easy. Today's guest, Jane Perlez, is a former New York Times Beijing bureau chief and now the host of the podcast Face Off, the U.S. versus China. Hearing Jane talk about covering America's wars, China's rise, and the shifting balance of power in Asia is a special treat. From her early days in Australia to Pulitzer Prize winning reporting in Pakistan and frontline postings in East Africa, Poland, the Balkans, Indonesia, and Beijing, she traces how 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and China's quiet advance into Southeast Asia diverted Washington's attention just as Beijing was making hay in the region. Jane reflects on a pivotal moment, a 2012 State Department banquet for then Vice President Xi Jinping, and how the U.S.-China relationship has descended from guarded optimism to open rivalry since then. Even after leaving Beijing in 2019, she has stayed on the story through podcasting, hoping to make China's politics, business, and society more accessible to global audiences. We also talk about Taiwan, Season 3 of Face Off, and what Jane sees as America's lingering naivete in foreign policy. Let's hear Jane's perspective. Welcome. We're so excited today to have, to be honest, I'm quite nervous.
Wenchi, you can't be nervous. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Not at this.
Someone, I think anyone who pays attention to China would just feel awe in the presence of you and your reporting. So thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. I do want to start with your career. I know you've done quite a bit of podcasting, but talking about yourself probably not as often. What got you interested in journalism?
Journalism, that's different to podcasting. So I have to confess, I grew up in Australia, so I went to university in Australia, and I always wanted to be a journalist. I think it was because a woman historian lived next door to us when I was growing up, and she was sort of like a journalist in a way, and I think she had a sort of subliminal influence. But anyway, when I finished university, the editor of the best paper in Australia, The Australian, which was a national paper, came to the university for Careers Week and said what it was like to be a journalist. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, I've heard this 1,000 times, I want a job. So I went to see him, he interviewed me, and I got a job. And I have to confess, the paper was owned by Rupert Murdoch, but it was a very good newspaper. It was sort of like the Washington Post. But then Rupert got tired of it and sort of junked it up and fired the really good editor who'd hired me. After I'd worked at The Australian for 3 years and got some experience, I left for New York and I got hired at the New York Post, which was 3 years later bought by Rupert Murdoch. Here he was yet again. So I left again. And I went to a little downtown newspaper, and then I went to the New York Times.
Very cool. And have you always known that you wanted to have an international journalist kind of career?
I don't know. I was fascinated by American politics at the time, so I covered a lot of politics. And then I met my husband, Ray Bonner, who was a foreign correspondent in El Salvador for the Times. And together we decided we'd like to go overseas. So my first assignment was in Africa, East Africa.
Yeah, I've read some of that. And how many posts have you had?
Well, I haven't actually counted, but I was based in East Africa covering Somalia, Ethiopia, all the hard countries, and then Poland. And then we lived in Vienna for 2 years when I was covering the end of the Balkans war in Kosovo. And then the bosses said, you've got to come back to the States and cover the State Department, and I fought like crazy because I didn't want to be in Washington. But it turned out to be a very good experience. I covered Madeleine Albright, it was that long ago when she was Secretary of State. Then I went overseas again to Indonesia, Pakistan, and then China.
Yeah, of course, you neglected to mention your Pulitzer Award. You're reporting in
Pakistan.
Pakistan. Yeah. I want to start with that because you are quite focused on China right now. And how was that earlier career influence your living and reporting from China?
I think that's quite easy to explain because when I was in Indonesia, based in Jakarta, I started just after 9/11. It seems a century ago now. Well, 2003, Wenchi Yu, the then premier, came down to the ASEAN meeting in Bali. And I think it was the first time the Chinese had come, and they came with a huge entourage. And there was not an American to be seen because the Americans were so involved in Iraq and Afghanistan.
9/11.
Yeah, they were just totally distracted. And you could see how China was just making hay out of this and coming down big time into Southeast Asia. So that was the start of my fascination. I never really tell people this, but I'll say this. I first went to China during the Cultural Revolution as an Australian university student. So I'd long been interested. And when the Chinese government officials started to come down into Southeast Asia in 2003-4, I thought, oh, here we go.
And did you know at that time, or did you know earlier in your career, you mentioned you went to China first as a university student, that you wanted to spend time in China. Did you know that?
When I was in Indonesia and then later in Pakistan, I wasn't driving thinking, oh, I must go to China, I must go to China. But the executive editor at the time, when I was ending up in Pakistan, Jill Abramson, said, why don't you go to China? You've long been interested in it. So it was a great opportunity.
Since then, we've been seeing your great reporting and writing about China. When did you move to China covering for New York Times?
It was 2012, and it was just after quite a famous visit to Washington by Xi Jinping. I don't know if you remember or if you've read that Xi Jinping came when he was still vice president as the guest of Vice President Biden and Hillary Clinton. And there was a lunch at the State Department. And I was going to China as a Beijing correspondent, and the State Department was very nice and invited me to that lunch. And I had a seat at a very close-in table, and that lunch left a huge impression on me because it was Valentine's Day and all the guests were like Bob Zellick, like Kevin Rudd, like the Chinese embassy people, Henry Kissinger, all the people who dealt with China in the previous 15, 20 years. And they all had huge smiles on their faces, not because it was Valentine's Day, but because they thought Xi Jinping was going to be exactly like his predecessors.
It was already announced that he was going to be the next.
Yes, it was already known he was going to be the next. I think that was largely why he was invited, as the incoming president.
And that was 2012.
That's when I
And
went.
that kind of optimism, did you share that optimism as
No,
well?
because I'd been in China at a different time. And also I think because I grew up in Southeast Asia and I could see the obvious geographic and political situation that was coming down the pike.
And did you ever share your almost like a cynicism about?
It wasn't cynicism, Wenchi. It was, I think it's just, I'm a realist, I wasn't cynical. I just thought that the Americans were a little naive. I mean, the American mantra, and I've always thought this foreign policy of the United States was a little naive. The mantra that if we treat everybody nicely on the outside, then they'll all become Democrats. Well, it's not always the case.
Yeah. So once you moved to Beijing, how long did you live there? From what year to what year?
From 2012 to 2019. I left just before COVID hit. I thought that, 7 years was a good run, and I wanted to do something else. I wasn't quite sure what, but I left in the fall of 2019, just a few months before my colleagues were essentially kicked out.
How was it like during the 7 years? Did you feel like you have to take on any particular way of telling the story coming out of China?
No, I don't think so. And I should explain that, we had a bureau of 8 reporters for the New York Times in Beijing. And my language skills are very limited. So I was really not covering domestic politics or domestic society. I did a little bit of that, but my remit was to basically cover China's foreign policy and its spreading influence in the world. For example, my first trip basically from Beijing was to go to Astana, Kazakhstan, when Xi Jinping was brand new president, brand new leader, and he went to announce One Belt, One Road. That was another memorable trip and another striking presentation by Xi Jinping. He spoke in a small auditorium at the university in Astana. It would have been about 200 people, students, and a full-fledged Chinese press corps, which was being managed by Qin Gang, who was then still the spokesman. And it was very interesting for me to...
Did you interact with Qin Gang?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
It was very interesting because I had traveled separately. I didn't travel in their bubble, obviously, but I landed in the university hall as they were assembling for the speech. The Chinese press were arrayed in the back seat of the auditorium, looking down at Xi Jinping. And several of the journalists took photographs of Xi Jinping at the lectern, and they loaded them onto their laptops. And I'll never forget this. Qin Gang took one of the laptops with an image of Xi Jinping at the podium and took it down to Wang Huning, who was sitting in the second row of the audience, and showed him the picture. Is this okay? And Wang Huning signed off, and then they sent it out. It was exactly the way it would operate with the State Department. You know, a journalist would take, or someone would take a photo, and the State Department wouldn't okay the picture, but the State Department would have a traveling photographer, right, and someone in the state, and then a State Department official could okay the picture.
Fascinating. You can tell that at that time already there is that close relationship. So other than One Belt, One Road, BRI, what were some of the bigger significant events that during your time in Beijing that made you feel like China was on the rise?
Well, I would say there was the court case at The Hague over the South China Sea. The Philippines took China to court and won, and Beijing took absolutely no notice of it. So, and by that stage they were starting to build artificial islands in the South China Sea for military purposes. So I think that was a benchmark. I traveled to Laos to see how, by this time it was called Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, to see how that was going and what China was doing in Laos, its neighbor. And that was another benchmark, I think. It was sort of the height of BRI. You know, since then it's come down. But you could see the amount of money and the amount of determination China was putting into Laos, into a railway that would connect with Thailand and then go down to Malaysia and Singapore. I think that was a very telling.
Did you also go to the Pacific or Latin America or other regions in the world where...
No.
Okay.
We have correspondent. New York Times has correspondents in those places. It wasn't really necessary for me to be. I went to Latin America when I was in Indonesia for something else, but not from China. I think also Xi Jinping's trip to Washington in 2015, which I covered, was very important. It was during the Obama administration, and he made a pledge not to interfere so much in the South China Sea, and went home and did exactly that. And the Obama administration essentially did nothing about it, which was another indicator that the Obama administration was still consumed by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and wasn't paying much attention to China spreading its wings in Asia-Pacific region.
Interesting you say that. Do you think that was the main reason, or the Obama administration didn't think China would rise so fast?
Oh, I think it was a combination of the two. Definitely a combination of the two.
And so when you were in Beijing, for example, covering and writing about those stories, seeing how China has been planning and doing all these diplomatic, or I should say projecting their power through those diplomatic mechanisms, did you get the sense that Washington, D.C. took notice?
Not really. Not really. And it wasn't only diplomatic, Wenchi, it was also economic. For example, China was doing huge trade with the countries in Southeast Asia, and they were responding. By the time I got to China, for example, China was doing enormous business with Australia on iron ore. The iron ore was going to China, being made into steel and building the cities that we see today. China was doing great trade in palm oil and other commodities with Malaysia. I remember Badawi's first trip to China in about 2004 or 5. He took 800 businessmen. I mean, It was just phenomenal. And you could just see the ties getting closer and closer. And at the same time, you could see that the United States was pulling back on its soft power. I'll never forget the United States closed its U.S. information centers, and they reopened little places in buildings and called them the America Corner, the American Corner. It would literally be a couple of bookshelves, a few laptops, and that was it. I mean, I'm talking about influence of China growing and growing in the region that I knew best in Southeast Asia, and America's influence diminishing. And while China was building roads and all kinds of infrastructure under BRI, the United States was not. USAID was basically a humanitarian organization in those countries. And I would say to the Americans, so what are you doing to counter this infrastructure? And essentially they would say, well, we're basically waiting for Bechtel to come in. I mean, Bechtel, one of America's biggest companies, they're never going to go to Southeast Asia and build things for the United States government. Forget it.
So while you were writing those stories, did you get a sense of how American readers, especially in Washington, D.C., think about it?
Not really. I'm not sure how much attention they were paying. I mean, people who cared about China paid attention, but I don't know how you feel, Wenchi, but I always feel people on the east coast of the United States really don't know that much about China, and it's very hard to get them interested. I mean, I'll tell you a classic story. It's a little embarrassing, but it's quite a classic story. Earlier this year, Ray and I had a dinner party in New York, which we often do because we've lived there for many years and we know a lot of publishers and book agents and people like that, filmmakers, etc. So we had a dinner at the beginning of the year, and in the middle of the conversation, someone piped up and said, oh, does China have nuclear weapons? I mean, yet this person knows everything about the Middle East, everything about Europe, everything about Russia, China, not so much.
So we talk about you're seeing China's rise in other parts of the world. What about domestic, since you actually live in? Did you get the sense that you were going to see China challenging our Silicon Valley or the U.S. when it comes to technology, scientific advancement?
You know, remember I left in 2019. It was beginning to grow, but it was, I felt that China was challenging the United States in finance. There were a lot of deals going down. I didn't cover them in particular. There was a lot of interest in investment in the United States, straight investment on Wall Street, etc. But you could feel it coming, but it hadn't. I didn't cover tech, and it hadn't quite expressed itself the way it has in the last couple of years.
Less through the national security lens, probably.
Right. There was a lot of penetration by China into the United States by hacking and so forth, cybersecurity situation. Right. That was beginning to get really, really serious. I think it was noticed by the Obama administration.
I think President Obama actually raised
He did raise it. He did raise it. And the Chinese promised to cut back, and they cut back a little, and then they came roaring back.
And did you feel that Chinese government officials, during your time there over 7 years, their attitude towards the U.S. was changing because they also became more aware of their own power?
Well, I think so. Mm-hmm. It's hard to express and give hard examples. Well, I could give this example. I don't know if it totally fits. But when I was leaving in 2019, Hua Chunying, who'd been the spokeswoman at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asked me to lunch. I thought it would be a polite lunch between two professionals for about an hour, and we'd say our farewells. Well, I got there, and she had turned up with about 5 aides, and of course I turned up by my little old self, and so I felt a little surrounded. But then she proceeded to basically give me a 3-hour lecture on the protests.
What did they complain?
Oh, no, it was at the start of the Hong Kong protest. She really went at it about Hong Kong and the protests and how the United States was responsible for these protests, and how in particular the Endowment for National Democracy was responsible for them, and how in particular Alan Weinstein, who founded the National Endowment, was responsible for these protests. I said, wait a minute, Alan Weinstein's dead. How can he have anything to do with it? But it was very, very strong and very strident, and that would certainly not have happened at the beginning of my tour.
I'm sure you have received many complaints from them.
Really? Not really.
Not really?
I'll tell you, there was one telling, but in hindsight, amusing incident. In 2018, when Xi Jinping announced that he was going to be president forever and that term limits were done with, my great colleague Chris Buckley, who's by far the most talented, industrious, and best-informed China reporter of any media, wrote a piece about Xi Jinping abolishing term limits. And he used a phrase saying that Xi Jinping had achieved this by swiftness, guile, and one other thing. So that the morning that it appeared, 8 o'clock, I get a phone call from the foreign ministry. Please come to the foreign ministry at 10 o'clock. Boom. So I thought, they're angry about something. So Chris and I went to the foreign ministry. There's that opening lobby with a lot of little rooms where you're basically taken to be either grilled or welcomed. Well, this day we were grilled, and we sat waited. And then 3 guys from the press section came. They were very senior, and they read from a document saying how bad this story had been and how Chris had violated every rule in the world, and in particular they took exception to the word guile. So they read this document, it's like a manifesto, and we started to ask some questions, polite questions, and no questions. They marched out and told us to leave. So that hit a nerve.
What was that year?
2018.
18, yeah. Have they ever asked you to retract a story or intervene in the middle of a story developing?
I mean, you could say this. I didn't go to Xinjiang, but our reporters went to Xinjiang. So as soon as reporters arrived in Xinjiang, they would be tailed and prevented from going to places. And when I went up to Dandong on the border with North Korea, I went several times, and they knew that I was on the flight. A Chinese colleague, and they would follow us. One time they followed us with, a ridiculous number of cars, maybe 6 or 7 cars following us to every place we went. So there was that kind of intervention.
But not to the extent that they would stop you or harass you.
Well, they didn't do that to me, but I think reporters definitely have been harassed in Xinjiang, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if that's still the same or worse now in China.
It's much worse in China for a simple reason. There are few Western reporters, very few American reporters, I should say. Why is that? Because in early 2020, the government in Beijing expelled, I think it was about 20 reporters, American reporters in all. The New York Times was left with 2, maybe 1 reporter at the time. We now have 2 reporters, down from 8 when I was there. The Washington Post has nobody on the mainland.
Are we referring to those foreign correspondents, or that include the local?
No. Foreign correspondents.
Okay, that need a visa, basically.
Yes. And why did this happen? It happened because the Trump administration, in about 2018, expelled 60 Chinese journalists who work for state media, saying that some of them were spies. And I often say, well, I have no doubt that some were writing notes to the MSS, but I'm sure that they're of little value to the MSS, and anyway, it's better to have people who you suspect are doing that in front of you instead of expelling them, especially since they knew that Beijing would retaliate and expel American reporters. The Trump administration didn't care about that. In fact, I think they actually wanted it.
So you thought that was a wrong move in terms of
expelling Chinese reporters? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And how come the Biden administration didn't try to resume?
Well, I think the Biden administration continued many of the policies of the Trump administration first term. They have a lot of things to discuss with China, from nuclear policy to economic policy, and the restoration of American journalists to Beijing, I would say, would be fairly low down the list.
One can argue that's extremely important, right?
Yeah, I think they may have tried, but I think it wasn't going to happen. I think the die was set. Once a policy like that is set, very difficult to reverse it.
Let's come to after you left Beijing and you joined Harvard, was that right, when you returned to the U.S.?
Yeah, I was very lucky and very pleased. I got a fellowship at the Schonstein Center here at Harvard, and I'll tell you a little story about how I got into podcasting. So I arrive at the Schonstein Center and I say, so I'm supposed to write this paper. How long is this paper supposed to be? Someone said 15,000 words. I said, what? I've never written 15,000 words in my life, and I'm not starting now. I said, I'm going to do a podcast. But honestly, Wenchi, I didn't really know what a podcast was. I mean, I'd listened to a few, but I had no idea how to make one. So I went to Adam Moss, who was a very well-known editor of New York Magazine, who was also at the Schonstein Center for this period. I said, Adam, what do I do now? He said, oh, you better go and find a producer. So lucky we were in Cambridge, which is close to Boston, which has a lot of radio stations, as you know, and a lot of podcast people. So I found a great producer, Jeb Sharp, who'd worked for NPR as a foreign correspondent and had worked on a lot of podcasts. And so she and I put together a podcast called On the Trail of Xi Jinping. And it actually covered what we've just been talking about, the change in aspect and outlook between the United States and China during the period of his rule up till 2019. And we started with that Valentine's Day lunch. So it's a high point, and then the descent down from there.
So how is it like observing China and continuing to think about China from the U.S., from Harvard?
Well, as you know, Wenchi, there are a lot of brains and...
Yes. Lots of thinkers, big thinkers.
And a lot of people who studied China, but there's one obvious gap, and that's the presence of Chinese people, academics, officials, thinkers. The number of Chinese coming to Harvard has diminished since I've been here, for all the reasons that you and I know.
You noticed that as
Very
well.
much so.
Has that affected how you think about China, observe China? And
I think it's hard to have the reality of what's going on in China if you're not traveling there, and it's hard if you don't have a constant stream of visitors. But I keep track as well as I can through the people who visit Harvard, who are obviously in tech or who are in various fields, business, who interact with the government. And occasionally we get visitors. Ah Wei, for example, who's very well known, has been through here occasionally. I mean, we interview Zhou Bo on this current season of Face Off, but I did it from Beijing to Cambridge. I mean, he has not been here. I mean, it's very hard because Chinese visitors get searched and questioned at the airport, and they don't want to go through that. I quite understand it.
you mean them coming here, right? I think that's the other side of the story, that oftentimes Chinese would complain to us because, I mean, in recent years, you probably have heard about this. You know, they complain that Americans don't go to China anymore. And we would say, well, there's a lot of concern about security and safety, etc. And then they would say, well, vice versa, because a lot of their scholars have encountered exactly what you just described, which was kind of a surprise to me because you don't hear about it in the news or in.
Well, I think the one difference is, Wenchi, I think when Chinese scholars and businessmen come here, the likelihood of them being arrested and put in jail is low unless they've made some criminal offense or unless they've done something like that. But I think for Americans going to China, it's a little bit more unpredictable.
Are you concerned, will you try to go to China, or have you tried?
I haven't had the opportunity to try so far, and we'll see about that.
Now, we want to talk about Face Off.
Well, thank you.
Season 3. Why specifically Face Off?
I wanted to do something that reflected China to a general audience, perhaps an audience like my friends in New York who don't know very much about China and would like to know more. I mean, despite the fact they don't know anything, they are curious. So I wanted to present episodes that are accessible to both the knowledgeable and the not so knowledgeable. I mean, I don't want to sound like a total do-gooder, but I think it's important.
I think all of us are doing this because we think it's extremely important.
Yeah. Otherwise, it just becomes a barrier of ignorance, which is really dangerous, I think.
So I have so many questions about that because, yes, I mean, in some way, there's less travel in between the two countries, but there's not a lack of information. Now, you can argue what kind of information is out there. Why do you think the understanding of China seems to be less and less? And probably vice versa, the understanding of the US as well. You can find so much writing, and it's not just mainstream media writing. It's a lot of bloggers, it's a lot of individual writers and podcasters. And so there's abundant information. What's going on? What's wrong?
It's very hard to encapsulate, but I think historically there's been little knowledge about China. I can only speak really about the east coast of the United States. There's been little real knowledge about China, except those who've decided to study it, among people, the European population on the east coast in New York, Washington, and Boston. I mean, it's just I mean, Boston in the 19th century did a lot of trade with China, and so there's some knowledge from that. New York similarly. But as I said earlier, I think that the European population on the East Coast has always been more riveted, more fascinated, and more connected to Europe and the Middle East. Also, I think we should remember that China was closed off from the end of World War II until the opening with Richard Nixon in 1972, but even after that, even up until Tiananmen Square, even up until 2000, it seemed a long way away and very remote. And it was the economic connections that made the change. As China became a manufacturing power, people in the United States had to wrestle with it. I mean, even my friends in the book publishing industry were seeing China as a big economic possibility where their books were being translated and distributed in China. So trade and the economic situation changed it all.
The cultural difference, perhaps?
Definitely.
Less European.
Definitely. There's a language barrier. And, I think that it's also the lack of real cultural presence. I mean, the Metropolitan Museum in New York has put on a few China shows from time to time, but they're very sort of, in my mind, they're kind of quite artificial and big dramas, and then they go away. So there's not a lasting and continuing cultural exchange either.
But now you think it's different?
No, not really.
Even with so much going on in the media?
I'm talking about ordinary people. No. Obviously, it's politically and economically, it's huge.
Right.
But I thought you were talking about, I don't like to use the phrase people to people, but I'm talking about awareness of China as a country, some understanding of it and some fascination with it and some continuous wanting to know among educated people on the East Coast. I'm doing this podcast because I'm hoping it appeals to lots of people who sort of think they should know about China, but don't find it really accessible. So I'm hoping we make it sounds a little corny, but I hope we make it somewhat accessible. So our second episode is with Zhou Bo, who's very well known as a retired senior colonel of the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and he talks about China's new acquisitions of new weapons, missiles that hypersonic missiles that the United States doesn't have, robots, drones, etc. He's allowed by the Chinese government to talk, but that's fine. He talks in a reasonable way, and I think that's another way to make China understandable.
Your podcast has been quite interesting because there is a lot of historic content that probably is not what you usually see in today's media, because people tend to focus on current events, not so much about the historic context. So in that sense, that's extremely helpful. And you continue to break news, like Deng Xiaoping's visit to the CIA. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, that was actually on an earlier. I did a podcast series on the Nixon diplomacy to China. That was before I started Face Off. And I really liked that series, I have to say, because that diplomacy was quite amazing and very dogged on both sides. We broke this story of Deng Xiaoping going to the CIA. I was very happy to do that. In fact, an old China hand, whose name I'm not going to mention, was at a conference here at Harvard last week, and he said, "How did you get that story?" I said, "Well, I had a really good source." And then I said to him, I was interviewing former Secretary Robert Gates about current relations between China and the United States. And I said to Secretary Gates, "And by the way, Deng Xiaoping went to the CIA in 1979 during his visit then." And Gates said, "Yes." So I was so thrilled because it was a second source. So you always have to have two sources.
Did you ever ask them why the U.S. got Xi Jinping wrong or underestimated China?
I haven't asked them directly. I think, Washington was not the only one to get Xi Jinping wrong. There were a lot of people in China who got him wrong because his father had been in the latter part of his career, after he was brought out of purgatory and exile, his father was a reformer. And so I think there was some thinking that son like father. And I think people in the United States who were doing trade and business thought that it was, quote unquote, from a Chinese point of view, win-win situation.
And it's probably the U.S. projection of its own desire to see where China is headed.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of that in American foreign policy.
I absolutely, completely agree.
I mean, how naive can you be thinking that Myanmar, former Burma, is going to become a democracy? It's just insane because there's some brave politician at the head, and therefore Myanmar is going to stay in our column. And as soon as Aung San Suu Kyi disappeared, of course the Chinese made huge hay, and they're basically, no one's in charge of that country, but if any foreign power is, it's the Chinese who are the closest.
Do you think it was more about Xi Jinping as the leader of China that made China much more assertive today? Or do you think it's inevitable, meaning because of the way Chinese political system works and the way China becomes more aware of its power and influence in the world, that it doesn't matter who the leader it is in today's chairman position, that China is going to behave this way regardless?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think you could have a different leader and a different outcome. I'm not saying that China and the United States would be best pals. I think by the nature of the power, economic power, and other kinds of power, that they're going to be incredible competitors. But I think that Xi Jinping is a particular leader who really does believe very strongly that China is on the rise and the United States is, by virtue of its scrappy democracy, is on the decline. So I'm not sure that every leader of China would necessarily believe that at this point in time. I think he has a particular firm view of this, and I think he has a particular desire to make sure that his view is inculcated in the Chinese people. In the current system, his view, it's my way or the highway. Very little, almost no dissent. I mean, so much so you could take the story that Vivian Wang, the fantastic New York Times reporter currently in Beijing, she wrote a story recently about a very small film festival that was going to take place in the United States, featuring small, beautiful but basically unknown Chinese movies. And the families of these movie directors were harassed inside China.
Even though the festival
was in the United States.
Was in the U.S.
And the harassment of the relatives of the film directors was so intense they had to cancel the festival. Now, it's that kind of pressure that seems to me to be unnecessary and indicative of how firm Xi Jinping has put the word down the line that dissent will not be brooked. But dissent is happening. I mean, during
COVID, right?
During COVID, and even now, in our episode on Gen Z, Chang Che talks about how with 20% unemployment, this generation is quite unhappy and dissatisfied. So I said to him, do you think this generation will form a coalition of the very unhappy against Xi Jinping? Will they coalesce into a kind of opposition? And Chang Che said, well, the Kindle is getting drier.
I remember that sentence. Yeah.
So that's quite telling.
Yeah. We have to talk about Taiwan. What do you think Xi Jinping really wants?
Oh, I think he wants Taiwan.
I know. I mean, do you think, for sure, if you want to talk about inevitability, I think that's where they really think Taiwan will have to go back to China. But what do you think he's going to do?
I don't know what he's going to do, but I think that Trump has given enough signals that it's a good time for Xi Jinping to press the issue. I mean,
say more.
Trump has, I mean, you know this better than I, Wenchi. Trump.
I want to hear you say.
Trump has put up his Sharpie pencil and said, this is Taiwan, and here's my Resolute desk, and this is China. He's given enough impression that he is not interested in really defending Taiwan if it's attacked. Now, is Xi Jinping going to attack Taiwan? I'm of the camp that essentially thinks probably not, because it's a big risk and it's not necessarily going to end the way he wants. But I do think that he's going to, and they're illustrating it now, they're going to try and get Taiwan by other means, blockade, essentially blockade and harassment over the median line has been crossed so many times now it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. The Chinese military is growing day by day, but they're facing these purges by Xi Jinping, which is not exactly clear why he's purging the military. So maybe he's not going to invade Taiwan because he can't exactly trust the military. I'm exaggerating. But the military, the PLA, is not exactly in a smooth situation at the moment with so many generals purged. And the other day when they launched the new aircraft carrier, there were a couple of admirals who seem to be missing. So this may not be the ultimate time for Xi to do an invasion plan. But I'm of the school that thinks he sees Trump as being less than firm on defending Taiwan.
And do you believe when Trump said that Xi Jinping told him when he's in the White House, China is not going to do anything?
I'm not sure about that. Who knows what Trump heard or what he chose to hear.
One more thing about Taiwan I want to ask you is you did write about Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
A little bit, but not so much. I was in South Korea at the time.
Yeah, and that was after you did the Harvard Fellowship.
I did 6 months I went back to the New York Times and helped out in the Seoul Bureau. Mm-hmm. I've only been to Taiwan once. It was a fascinating visit. I did a story about TSMC. It would have been 2022 or 3. Oh. It was a time when young Taiwanese tech workers who had gone to the mainland felt some pressure to come back home because things were getting a little tight back on the mainland. So that was basically my view. But I have to say, this is probably too controversial to say outright, and I'm not painting a black and white picture, but I did feel that people, understandably, people in their 20s really don't want to fight, don't want to be in a war. I think that's another complexity.
So you do have questions about Taiwan's will to fight.
Exactly. You?
I have my own view. I do think the current government is doing a lot to try to build up that will. So compared to even 5 years ago, I think there's growing will. But again, nobody really knows, right? Nobody knew that Ukraine would fight for so long. So I think it is a big question. But I don't think people should question Taiwan's resolve to defend itself. If anything, I think I just told you, I just came back from Taiwan. It was abundantly clear to me. You can say, oh, there's no way Taiwan can defend itself, etc. But given where the US is right now, everyone I talked to in the government has said, and I've never felt this way, that they're determined to defend themselves. Determined. And that is seen as priority. And it's very intentional, systemic in terms of arms purchases, and just everything is civil military fusion in terms of how they're educating the public about defense. Everyone is receiving a notebook about how to defend yourself. Having grown up in Taiwan in a completely different climate, I have to say it's quite a shock to me. Anyway, I want to move on to talk about China's own storytelling. I find it fascinating. There's just so much information out there in English that is written by Chinese citizens about what is happening in China, or their observations and views about the US, Taiwan, foreign relations, etc. How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's great that people, are writing a lot about the United States. I think it would be even better if they were able to have more first-hand experience. I do think the propaganda machine in China is very intense.
That is state-sponsored media propaganda.
It's very intense. And I'm not a student of social media in China, but I can see a lot of it's really, really interesting. I would take as an example the story of Auntie Min. I think it was Auntie Min, this older woman who wanted to divorce her husband and went on the road and wrote posts about her travels around China. And it reflected a change in social mores and understandings. And I think she posted on social media, should I divorce him or should I not? And in the end, I think she decided to. But I think there are sort of life stories like that are just all-consumingly interesting for outsiders as well as the local population.
Chinese society continues to be just so fascinating to probably all of us. But in the meantime, their censorship machine is all out. I'm on all kinds of social media, the Chinese type. And anything that mentions Taiwan, it just seems that the censorship has heightened even more.
Right, and I think it's quite dangerous because the censorship is heightened, and at the same time, access for ordinary people to Western media and Western point of view gets narrower and narrower. That's a lethal mixture. I interviewed Jake Sullivan, who I knew, of course, as a reporter, and I told Jake, when I asked him if he'd come on the show, that I wanted to talk about Xi Jinping because he sat across the table with him, negotiating with him in August 2024 in the waning days of the Biden administration. And I've always been curious to know what Xi Jinping is like in the room. Because when I was a reporter in Beijing, in the early days of the Xi Jinping era, when Americans were still coming to China, it was always so fascinating. We of the Western press would be taken into the room in the Great Hall of the People where the Americans and Xi Jinping were going to meet. And we'd be taken into the room early. And so we would be lined up against a red rope. And then Xi Jinping would walk out and would stand in usually a big circle in the middle of the carpet with his hands folded in front of him, just waiting for the American delegation to come. We were about 6 feet, no more, about 12 feet away from each other. He never looked in our direction, and he always looked so serious. And then the Americans would come in, it would be Hillary Clinton or, I don't know, this one or that one, John Kerry at the time, and they'd shake hands, and then we'd be shown the door very quickly by this Chinese security guards. So I've often thought, what is he really like? So I said to Jake, what's he really like? And he said, basically, different to what you'd expect. When he negotiated with him in, I think it was August 2024 in Beijing, he said, not only on that occasion, but other occasions in closed-door talks, Xi Jinping is quite relaxed. He is obviously a big man, and his body language dominates the room, but he sort of relaxes in his chair and affects this kind of cool kid-in-the-class posture. And he talks to his aides when he's got a question. Jake said he doesn't really question his aides, but he sort of has some banter backwards and forwards. And it sounds much more relaxed than you would think. So I found that pretty interesting.
What are the other episodes that are coming up?
So we have, after Jake, we have an episode on robots and how China is killing it on the robot front and outsmarting the United States at every corner. And then I think very unusually, Wenchi, I went to Port Moresby. Do you know where Port Moresby is?
Of course, PNG.
Exactly.
I have been.
Been there?
Yeah, when I was at the State Department, I went there twice.
Quite interesting. So I went there for a football match. Why a football match? There is obviously a China element. The Australian government and the Papua New Guinea government have signed an agreement that the Papuan football team, they're fantastic at football in Papua New Guinea. They are the toughest rugby players you can find. And Australians are mad about rugby. So the Australians have accepted the Papua New Guineans into their football league, national league, on the grounds that they don't accept any military help from the Chinese. It's basically an anti-China pact. So I went up to Port Moresby and found this wonderful Chaz, this wonderful host of the FM station up there. And we went to the football match together and we listened to the crowd go totally wild about the football. And then I interviewed a very interesting Papua New Guinean in Sydney, who's a lawyer, who explained the whole deal. And it's important because Australia is an important ally of the United States, and for Australia to be taking this step is quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, can't wait to listen to every episode.
Well, thank you, Wenchi. Very happy to be able to talk about it.
No, I mean, I think you're doing everyone a service to continue doing this work. So thank you so much, Jane, for joining us today.
Thank you, Wenchi, and keep up the good podcast work.
Thank you. With so much English language coverage of China today, understanding this emerging superpower often swings to extremes. As the United States grapples with what many call its most consequential bilateral relationship, China will continue to dominate the headlines across both traditional media and social platforms. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.